Over the following weeks, my new camp worked out as I had been hoping. It gave me the shelter I needed, as well as the vantage point from which to survey the ocean for potential rescue. It was close to my freshwater source and had a great position for fishing, which yielded me some great catches since moving there. It also provided greater shelter from the rains, which were torrential and very monsoon-like at times. It just didn't seem as if they were going to stop. My thoughts of setting fire to the hills and forests began to dwindle, and rescue seemed like an unobtainable dream. Days became weeks, and weeks became months, as I realized that my friends and family would soon accept their perceived reality of my death. To what would I return? I knew that certain friends would be happy to know I was alive and back in the world, but how much would they have gone through in accepting my death? How few would have even cared? My prison began to feel like home. My prison guard began to feel like my only friend, and I spoke to him regularly while looking out over the sunrise and sunset. The chanting and beating of the drums also faded into the background, to blend in with the natural sounds of the island. Should I just resign myself to a life on the island of hell? What most would consider to be a paradise. I missed all things I took for granted. Human contact, the taste of fast food and drinks. My last Pepsi ran out a week before. I missed the biased fake news and all that came with it. The scandals, the false theories, the myths, the stories which made society turn. More often than not, my thoughts turned to tears and my tears to fears, until regrets turned to thoughts of suicide. Living out the rest of my life on this hell in paradise was not an option for me. I either escaped or I would die trying. After a couple of months of relentless rain and storms, the sky finally let through a few rays of sunshine. Little by little, the rains became less and less until the sun regained its full glory in the sky, and the warmth of subtropical sun began to shine through the grey of what was becoming a normal day in hell for me. My routines, which by this time became a matter of life and death, began to teach me more and more about what was truly important in life. The thoughts of elegant foods began to drift away. A fillet of beef, next to sautéed vegetables and wild rice with a pepper sauce reduction, became the catch of the day with whatever grass or herb the birds were eating at that time. Dessert was more often than not some form of coconut or juice from sugarcane, or whatever my imagination could bring to the front of my mind. There wasn't much choice on the island. Whenever possible, bananas, mangoes, or figs were also part of the dessert menu. Even if they were green, whatever form of tropical fruit were on the island, I found them and they completed my menu for the day. Needless to say, I lost a great deal of weight. As the land dried out from the rains, I began to put my plan to burn the hills and forests into action. Each day, as I foraged for food, I stocked up wood, leaves, and flammable garbage I found washed up on the beach. In different areas around the trees near the peaks, I started my piles. I planned my escape routes from each ignition point to the next, as well as back to the beach and my cave. Wind direction and speed would be very important in determining where I initiated the fire and in which direction I would move from pile to pile. By the time the earth was dry once again, I had the entire forest on the hills near the ruins completely surrounded with piles of materials for starting the burn. If I was lucky and the wind was blowing from the southeast, I would only need to set one pile on fire, which would burn to the rest and away from my cave. I decided to wait for the wind to come from that direction, and it didn't take long. The day the wind direction changed to the southeast, the sound of the chanting and the drums, which I had not heard in a while, returned to the foreground of the natural island's noises. I set out to the hills just after lunch, with my knife strapped to my leg and carrying only a water bottle and the lighter which I found on the crashed airplane. I took one last look around the abandoned ruins, gathered up the dry grass I would use to initiate the fire, and headed to the first pile. The drums were beating louder now, but I ignored them and moved ahead with my plan. I started the fire, stuck around long enough to ensure the pile would burn efficiently, and then quickly made my way back down to camp. I turned a few times as I walked to verify that the fire was spreading and growing as my plan required, and it was. It seemed as if my idea was working, and by nighttime, the entire hill would be burning and visible for many kilometers in every direction. As I reached camp, I began to hear the faint cracking of the fire and smell the smoke. My strategy was working. The fire would soon have the entire hill surrounded and engulfed in flames. It was going to be an amazing sight. By the time darkness fell, the fire was spreading well and going up the mountain as I had hoped. Even though I felt bad about setting fire to the forest and knew what it meant, I knew it was my only chance to attract attention to the island, and from that perspective, it was a thing of beauty. By morning, the people from the other islands should be on their way to investigate the burning island. There was no way the fire would not be visible everywhere, and rescue should soon be here. I prepared myself for what I hoped would be my last night alone on the island. I even felt a bit nostalgic about it. After all, the island, as harsh and scary as it was at times, provided for me and took care of me. I felt bad about burning the ruins, but I had no other choice. From time to time during the night, I came out of my cave to check on the fire and admire it, while fantasizing about rescue and what it would be like to be back home and sleeping on a normal bed. I couldn't wait. By the next morning, almost the entire hill was burning, and smoke was billowing high into the sky. I began my surveillance of the horizon, hoping the first of many boats would soon be there, and I was not disappointed. It wasn't long before I saw the first boat appear in the distance. I ran to the edge of the overhang from which I fished, carrying a makeshift flag on a long stick and waving it like crazy as I watched the boat getting closer. As it got closer, I realized it was one of the small fishing boats the islanders used, and they had seen me. They were headed directly towards me, and a sigh of relief escaped me. Rescue had finally arrived. They were almost to the point where the airplane wreckage was those many months ago, and as I made my way down to the beach and out onto the reef, I saw the beast. He was swimming towards me as well, and then I saw his fin disappear under the water. A moment later, he reappeared, launched himself out of the water and onto the deck of the small fishing vessel. I stood there mesmerized at his mammoth size, realizing he was much bigger than I thought, and much bigger than the boat. I could hear the screams of terror and agony emanating from those on the boat, and I dropped to my knees in tears and disbelief. I had lured them to their deaths at the jaws of this giant predator. Guilt filled my soul as I screamed out in anger and hatred, not only at the shark, but also at myself for what I had caused. As the last piece of the boat disappeared under the waves, I stood at the edge of the reef, shaking my head as the tears rolled down my face. He just swam by slowly and casually, turning on his side and slightly raising his head out of the water to look at me tauntingly. He wanted to let me know I was not going anywhere. It would take much more than a little fishing boat to take me from this hell and him. What kind of beast was he? What kind of beast was I for causing the deaths of those on that boat? My joyful thoughts of rescue began to turn to dread and fear, not for myself, but for anyone else who would approach the island on such a small boat. My selfish need for rescue caused the deaths of the men on that boat, and would cause the deaths of others that day if I could not find a way to warn them. Suddenly I remembered the VHF radio I recovered from the crash, and as I turned to run for the shore, I realized that he, the beast, was already on his way around the reef. I didn't care. I ran across that reef and did not pause when I reached the edge. I dove straight in and swam as fast as I could to the shore. I made it. I pulled myself up the beach and turned to see him swimming just a few meters off the shore in front of me. He was taunting me. He was making sure I understood that I was his prisoner or food. I ran to the cave to get the VHF radio and then to my lookout. I needed to warn any other small skiffs approaching the island of the danger of approaching the island in such small vessels. I knew the battery on the VHF was low, so I decided I would not turn it on until I saw a boat in range. It didn't take long before the next boat appeared on the horizon, and I could tell it was another small boat. That would make a snack for the beast if it came too close. I turned on the radio and tried frantically to reach the boat. I tried what I knew to be the emergency frequencies, which were channel 9 and channel 16. I hoped these channels would be monitored and used for the same purposes as back home. It was my only chance for saving the lives on these boats. Unfortunately, not all of these small fishing boats were equipped with these radios. I hoped and prayed these boats would be. It was the only chance to save the lives of anyone on a small approaching vessel. The only chance they had to signal for a larger craft or helicopter to be the mode of my salvation. As the boat got closer, I tried the radio, first on channel 9, then on channel 16. No response. Was I being heard? Did they even have a radio? They were about 2 kilometers offshore, so they must be in range. Then it happened. Again, that animal attacked and took the boat down. More lives lost because of my selfish need for rescue. Rage flowed through my veins. Rage at that shark and rage at myself for what my actions had caused. More lives were lost because of me. Hate, revulsion, disgust, you name it, and I was feeling it. I was nauseated by what I caused. The horrible fate that I brought upon these poor souls. The same fate my grandfather encountered at his end. It was too late to do anything to stop other boats from coming, but I hoped my message would be received by someone, anyone who might be listening. Another boat approached and my message went out again. This boat had a radio and responded, but yet again, it was too late. I could hear the screams of agony over the radio. I could feel the pain in their voices over the radio, but I could offer no reprieve from their violent and painful, horrific deaths over the radio. Tears rolled down my face. My voice cracked as I pleaded for no one else to attempt to rescue. I fell to my knees and begged whatever deity existed above us to save the lives of these poor souls. They did not deserve this fate, and I did not deserve their sacrifice. My selfish desire for salvation and return to society had cost the loss of lives, loss which would be felt by their families and friends, loss which was not deserved, loss which I could no longer handle. If this demon wanted me, it was going to get me. If that is what it took to save the lives, then that is what it was going to get. But I was taking it with me. I was not going down alone. That beast was coming with me. I did not realize how much time had passed, but it had been a number of hours of watching boat after boat with precious lives on board being lost. Lost because of me. Debris from the slaughter began to drift ashore, and something red caught my eye. Down on the beach was a large red object. I got to my feet and made my way down to the water's edge below my lookout. The red object, which I saw from above, turned out to be a fuel container. I retrieved it from the waves and brought it up onto the sand. I opened the container and sniffed the contents, and it was indeed fuel. I remembered the flare gun I recovered from the crash and the small oxygen tank in one of the backpacks which I had taken. A plan formulated in my head, a plan based on the movie Jaws, which I saw in my childhood. If I needed to sacrifice myself to save innocent lives, then that is what I was going to do. I ran back to the cave to retrieve the oxygen tank and the flare gun. I tied the oxygen tank to the fuel canister and then tied them to the arm of one of those who perished from one of the skiffs which washed ashore. I grabbed the flare gun kit and made my way back down and onto the reef. I began slapping the surface of the water and shouting for the beast to come get me. It wasn't long before he showed up. He began swimming up and down in front of where I was standing on the reef, his eyes glaring at me each time he swam by. I begged the entity above for forgiveness and jumped into the water with the shark. I could see his massive dorsal fin coming towards me, and a few meters before he reached me, he disappeared under the surface of the water. I stuck my head under the water to look for him and prepared myself for my last moments of life. I saw his jaws open as his massive form raced to the surface for me. His meal. His last meal. I maneuvered the fuel tank into position, in line with my body, and readied the flare gun. I felt the massive impact from the dispersion of the water as his enormous form surged upward and breached the surface, pushing me into the air. I was thrown about 3 meters above the level of the water, as time slowed to a snail's pace and the beast's jaws opened below me. I saw his eyes rolling into his head for protection as I twisted my body into position while falling back down towards the open jaws of the shark. I managed to shove the fuel tank with the oxygen canister strapped to it into his mouth just before the impact of his upward surge knocked me backward onto the reef. He began chomping down on what he thought was my body. I could see the fuel tank rupture as I took aim with the flare gun. I heard the pop of the gun firing and saw the flare enter his enormous mouth. It was a direct hit. His mouth erupted in flames from the fuel leaking out of the tank, and as he bit down again, this time on the oxygen canister, there was the explosion I was hoping for, and his head blew apart. The concussion from the blast threw me back several meters, and as I got to my feet, pieces of shark head, his jaws, his teeth, his eyes, were falling from the sky. The beast was dead. The creature, which had been keeping me prisoner on the island for so many months, was finally gone. I reloaded the flare gun and fired another flare into the air to signal the approaching boats. As they got closer, I dove from the reef and swam to the closest boat. They helped me to climb on board. As that boat turned to head back to the main island, we felt a sudden thump, and the boat rocked. My heart stopped and my imagination went wild. There were more than one of these beasts, and this one was just waiting to get me on one of these skiffs to be part of his meal. I grabbed for my knife. I was not going down without a fight, and I felt the hand of one of the men on the boat hold my hand to prevent me from taking my knife from its sheath. "It's okay," he said. "We just got bumped by one of the other boats."